Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 3, Episode 32, Peace Through War. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. First, let's welcome the new members of the House of Lords. Jake, Earl of Hetherington, John, Baron Hanson, and Rosa is now Countess of Roxburgh. All patrons get ad-free versions of the podcast. If you want to join their ranks, go to patreon.com/PaxBritannica to find out more. Last week, we saw the creation of the Protectorate. The Commonwealth's third government in a year, this one would have some sticking power. The brainchild of John Lambert, his instrument of government was the first written constitution in English history. Based on the Heads of Proposals and the Officers' Agreement of the People, the instrument tried to find a middle way between the tyranny of an overmighty executive and the tyranny of an overmighty legislature. Charles I represented the former, of course, but Lambert and the army's experiences with parliaments hadn't been much better. The Long Parliament, which had governed during the Civil Wars, had been so hostile to the army that it had to be purged, but even that purged rump was eventually dissolved at the end of a musket. Even the hand-picked nominated assembly, bare bones as Parliament, had veered too far from what the army believed was the best course for the country. At each point, it was the army which had decided the course of events. In a way, the instrument of government made the political reality official. Oliver Cromwell, as the commander-in-chief of the army, was already the most powerful figure in the Commonwealth. Making him the central figure of a new government made practical sense. We also covered some of the reforms which the new regime rapidly implemented. The Court of Chancery was finally reformed, and the continued reformation of English and Welsh churches gained new life. With Cromwell's backing, a new body was established to ensure that new church ministers were properly trained and morally upright. Another was set up to vet and eject any existing ministers who failed to meet standards. Today, we're going to look outside the borders of Cromwell's new domain as we bring the First Anglo-Dutch War to an end. Last time we looked at this, General at Sea George Monk led the States Navy to victory in the Battle of Scheveningen. Admiral Martyn, the foremost Dutch naval commander of the age, was shot and killed in the fighting, but this battle didn't end the war. Tromp's subordinate, Admiral de Witt, was sent out once again to help shepherd Dutch merchant ships home. De Witt, who as we well know was not one to avoid a fight, didn't want to do it, mainly because the fleet he was given was in a terrible state. Quickly cobbled together by the States General, who were doing their best to understate the losses of Scheveningen, de Witt didn't think it could survive a fight, or was even in good enough condition for escort duty. But orders were orders, and de Witt set out. He avoided Monk, who had quickly patched together his own force, but when the English admiral learned de Witt had got away, he didn't chase him. It was now September, and the North Sea was a dangerous place for his battle-weary fleet. De Witt managed to gather about 400 merchant ships, and then he set off for home, leaving many stragglers who hadn't yet made the rendezvous. But de Witt had no choice. His ships were in a poor state. He had very few supplies, and his crews were borderline mutinous. The weather was only getting worse, and he needed to get his ships to shelter. He led the convoy to port, and wanted to follow them in for repair and resupply, but he was ordered to stay at sea. The official reason was to wait for those stragglers, but really the States General was concerned that if de Witt entered a harbour, his crews would desert. By this point it was the end of October, and the weather only got worse. On the 30th, a storm hit, and de Witt's fleet was ravaged. 15 ships sank outright, another 24 were demasted, and many more were damaged. Hundreds of sailors were killed, in a disaster which overshadowed the losses of Scheveningen, or any other battle with the English. It was only after this disaster that the survivors were, finally, allowed into harbour, and that's where they stayed for the rest of winter. All the while, Monk and the States Navy were snapping up Dutch merchant ships with impunity, all across the North Sea, the Atlantic, and the Channel. In England, opinion was divided over the war. During the sitting of the nominated assembly, there were many voices calling for the complete defeat and conquest of the Dutch. Many of these voices were Fifth Monarchists. The Fifth Monarchists, including Major General Harrison, viewed Dutch reluctance to form a union with the Commonwealth, and then their military actions in the war, as tantamount to religious treason. They had clearly been led astray by Mammon and their love of gold and wealth, and there was the presence of the Orangists, with their leanings towards monarchy and their sympathy with the House of Stuart. And the Dutch Reformed Church was a bit too Presbyterian. For these reasons, Fifth Monarchists demanded the complete defeat of the Dutch and their forceful incorporation into a godly state. Jesus was on the way, and everything had to be ready for his arrival. The conquest of the Netherlands also played into Fifth Monarchist prophecy. When Jesus returned, the Dutch provinces would act as a beachhead for a march on Rome and the dethroning of the Antichrist. But, on the off chance that Jesus wasn't going to make an appearance, and the Prince of Peace wasn't available to lead an army of conquest, any military action would obviously be led by Cromwell. And he had no truck with Fifth Monarchist nonsense as far as he could see. Cromwell, as I've said before, had not been in favour of the war in the first place. The victories over the Dutch did give him pause, because with his devoutly providential outlook, this was clearly an intervention from God. Just as God had given Cromwell his victories in order to defeat the House of Stuart, perhaps he was giving the English these victories because the Almighty wanted the Dutch to lose. As we've seen, Cromwell did take a hard line in a meeting with the Dutch ambassadors, but it was also possible that this was a negotiating strategy. There were loud voices among the merchants, shouting for or against war, whichever suited their interest. Some were thrilled with the way the war was going. Dutch merchant and military ships flowed into English ports as prizes, and both the ships themselves and their precious cargoes were sold off for a tidy sum. But if some merchants were winning, that means that others were losing. And among those were the backers of the Levant Company and the East India Company. The Dutch had been very successful in the Mediterranean, and so Levant Company ships risked attack from the Dutch or from pirates without the protection of the state's navy convoys. In Asia, the Dutch had already had quite a strong position in the spice trade, and though many Dutch East India Company ships were captured on the trip home, east of the Cape of Good Hope, the VOC held an advantage over the unsupported EIC. And of course, anyone whose trade relied on the Baltic was being iced out entirely. The Danes had closed the Sound to English shipping. Merchants who relied on trade with Poland or Sweden or the Baltic states were facing financial ruin. These companies favoured a peace which would free them from Dutch attack, and perhaps also mean generous concessions to their respective interests. Even before he became Lord Protector, Cromwell took a personal role in trying to find a peace, meeting with Dutch commissioners outside of the formal negotiations, such as when he met them in St. James's Park on the 14th of July. He reportedly told them, quote, "The world was wide enough for both, and if the two peoples could only thoroughly well understand each other, the two countries could overrule all others." End quote. He then informed the commissioners that he would not tolerate deception in their negotiations, and brought up how Charles I had repeatedly tried to deceive his English subjects and been defeated with the will of God. Over the winter, as De Witt took stock of his depleted fleet and Monk prowled the waves, the dramatic political events we saw over the last episode took place. The nominated assembly and the Fifth Monarchists who called for the conquest of the Netherlands were sidelined, and Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell came to the fore. Now, though he did favour peace, being too generous, when the English had clearly won, risked his new regime looking weak. Across the Channel, Dutch politics was almost as factional. Holland, as the province most invested in trade, and suffering perhaps the worst in the war, was broadly in favour of coming to terms. But as Grand Pensionary of Holland, Johan de Witt, not to be confused with Admiral de Witt, They're spelled differently, if you couldn't tell from my mangled pronunciation. Anyway, as Grand Pensionary de Witt had made clear before, they were the United Provinces, plural. The other states had a say, and many of them, especially the landlocked ones, were firmly Orangist. If the war carried on, political instability in both the Commonwealth and the Netherlands could only increase, to their benefit on both counts. English politics looked deeply unstable. 3 governments in a year, now an army general governing as Lord Protector, whatever that was, and it was possible that the Stuarts might be restored, either from internal unrest or from a combined Dutch-Franco intervention. But as the defeats wore on, it also weakened and delegitimized the statist provinces like Holland. It was possible that the Orangist cause would become more popular. Republicans like de Witt also saw these risks and were aware of the danger. The negotiations continued into the new year, as the protectoral regime established itself. Dutch negotiators found the Lord Protector hard to read, despite how much he talked. As always, he called on God, and for the Dutch to see God's will, and he often switched tack very abruptly, keeping the ambassadors off balance. But over the weeks of discussions, the Dutch came to understand Cromwell's objectives. His authority and new position owed nothing to the Fifth Monarchists, or to those merchants who were making their fortunes out of the war, so he had no real reason to either prolong the war or escalate it on their behalf. Cromwell's main priority was security. Security for English trade, of course, but security from the mortal enemy of the Republic and now the Protectorate, the Stuarts. The idea of a union was, in many ways, an echo of Scottish Covenanter hopes for the Solemn League and Covenant. It was defensive in intent. But, from the beginning of 1654, the demands for union, unrealistic as they really were, began to fall away, because security from the Stuarts could be secured another way. Central to the treaty which would be agreed was a promise by both countries not to support internal rebellion in the other, and not to play host to enemies of the other. It also required all Dutch office holders to swear an oath to abide by the terms of the treaty. There are other terms, we'll cover them shortly, but these conditions removed the danger of the Stuarts. Charles Stuart would no longer find support in the Netherlands, and that meant the loss of a substantial support base. Charles's Aunt Elizabeth had sat in exile in The Hague for many years during the 30 Years' War. Charles's sister, Mary, was the wife, and now the mother, of the Prince of Orange. Prince Charles could no longer find safe haven in this friendly country, at least for now. But this was only the public part of the deal. Separate to the official treaty was a promise by Johan de Witt that the States of Holland would pass an act of seclusion. This act banned the Prince of Orange from ever holding the Stadtholderate of Holland, or being its Captain General or Admiral General. Cromwell would have preferred this to be made law in all of the United Provinces, but there was no way that a treaty including that demand would ever get through the States General. This act was passed in secret by the States of Holland, and like that, Cromwell had his security. If the Prince of Orange was blocked from commanding Holland, with all its vast financial and naval resources, his threat would be minimal. The ambassadors of the other states had no idea that their Hollander colleagues had stitched up this deal, and were pleasantly surprised when the negotiations carried on and were quickly concluded. The treaty was signed by the Dutch and English representatives on the 5th of April 1654, and then ratified by the Lord Protector and the States General within a fortnight. The other articles tried to clear up the issues which had started the war. The English proposed an article allowing trade between the two countries as long as it respected each other's laws. This effectively meant that the Dutch would have to accept the Navigation Act and other limits to Dutch trade within the English colonies. The Dutch were far from keen, but when the most passionate voice against it suddenly died, it was accepted, with the Dutch intending to lobby for its repeal. Disputes over the border between the English colony of Connecticut and the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam were also not settled. It would take another 20 years before the English took control of it and changed its name. Maybe they liked it better that way. The Dutch agreed to salute the English flag, but did not agree that this implied English sovereignty. What it did acknowledge was the legitimacy of the new Protectorate. They also promised to punish the people responsible for the Amboina massacre, which was the torture and execution of English as well as Japanese and Portuguese traders 30 years previously. This was an empty promise because the article ends with the condition, quote, provided any of them be living. None of them were living, as it happens, which the Dutch, and presumably the English, knew full well. But both of these acknowledgements were for the benefit of English pride, and would go some way to appease angry English patriots. Another article instituted arbitration for future issues between the two countries. From here on, disagreements between the English and the Dutch were to be discussed and hashed out with the assistance of a neutral third party, the Swiss. One of the first issues addressed by the arbitration committee was compensation for Amboina, and a small amount was awarded by the arbitrators and paid out by the Dutch. The Dutch also paid compensation for ships trapped in the Baltic by their Danish allies. One interesting side note which I discovered researching the last episode is that at one point Cromwell sent the ambassadors a list of proposals, and the ambassadors sent the list right back. Not because they didn't agree with the substance of them, but because the Lord Protector hadn't got the list approved by his council. This could have been a diplomatic ploy, buying time, or just making sure there could be no future disagreement. It's also possible that the Dutch understood that the Council of State could not be ignored, they could not be bypassed, and that according to his own constitution, Cromwell needed their approval. It could have been both. The Dutch had lost the war, but the terms of the treaty were remarkably lenient. For the English, Churches and Hainsworth call it sauce without much substance. Barry Coward disagrees, pointing out that political and commercial objectives were met. The Dutch implicitly accepted the Navigation Act. Peace allowed English merchants to ply the waves without any restrictions from the Dutch. And politically, the public article against harbouring enemies and the secret act of seclusion removed the danger of a Dutch-backed Stuart restoration. After Portugal, Spain and France had acknowledged the revolutionary regime, the Netherlands had been the last European power which could, theoretically, launch a naval intervention of Britain and Ireland. That danger had now passed. The Stuarts might find sympathy from their former kingdom's neighbours, but not military support. So, the First Anglo-Dutch War is over, and the Protectorate is at peace. But internally, things are not so straightforward. Next time, we will cover Glen Cairns Uprising, a royalist rebellion in the Highlands of Scotland. I intended to cover that today, but I couldn't manage a longer episode. Because this is a Scottish June, I have of course caught a cold, which makes it hard to talk, and I just hope it hasn't come through the mic. Next week, this coming Saturday, I have a special interview with Dr. Juanita Cox, a research fellow at the Institute for Historical Research. She's been working on a project entitled The Windrush Scandal in a Transnational and Commonwealth Context, and after I met her at a workshop, I invited her on to speak about it. Obviously, the narrative of Pax is a few centuries away from the famous arrival of the Empire Windrush in 1948, but the so-called Windrush generation, the associated scandal, and the wider story of post-war, post-Empire immigration is so important to modern Britain that I felt it was worth jumping ahead just a little bit. It's a very engaging and at times emotional subject, and I hope everyone finds it interesting. One last piece of news. As you will have seen in your podcast feed, I'm doing a Q&A discussion with David Crowther of the History of England in a few weeks. There's more detail in that announcement episode, and you might have already listened to it, but the important thing to know is that if you want to send in questions, just follow the link in the description, or if you have a good memory, go to bit.ly/REVQA. That's bit.ly/RevQA. It's going to be a lot of fun. You can send questions in until the 14th of July, so don't delay. It'll come faster than you think. Thank you to my House of Lords, including the King's favourite Mike Sanders and Fernando Lopez Ojeda, Michelle Gersich, the Duchess of Devon, Alexander Travis, the Marquess of Hampton, and Richard Little, Earl of Bradford. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to join their ranks and listen to the podcast without ads. Remember that you can join the mailing list to get news about the show by going to the link in the description. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.